Lift-off spacelings, welcome back to Highway to Space, where we throttle past the ordinary and cruise into the cosmos. Today's guest is a star of astrobiology, a champion of ethical space exploration, Dr. Jacob Hack Mishra, COO of Blue Marble Space and director of the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, BMSIS. He joins us to talk about building a sustainable future, empowering young scientists, and why astronomy might just be the ultimate tool for equity. Jacob, thanks for warping into our studio.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start big. BMSIS mission is to explore life as a universal phenomenon. What do you turn, how do you turn that poetic phrase into real world science?
Yes, what we mean is thinking about life not as something that happens on a planet, but something that happens to a planet. So we are living organisms. There are certainly unique things about humans, but we are part of the ecosystem. We are one of the creatures on this planet, and we are connected not just to the animal kingdom, but to the entire biosphere. The biosphere is connected to the geosphere, the rest of the planet. And our planet interacts with space. And so we think about, number one, the future of life on Earth is more than just the future of humanity. It's the future of all of life and how the entire planetary living system of Earth will evolve and adapt and change with time. And then as we think about looking for other life elsewhere on Mars, on exoplanets, we're really thinking about looking for living systems. Again, not just life that happens to be on a planet, but what does it mean for life to modify a planet on a global scale? And so we're really thinking about life. To what extent is the property of life something endemic to the universe and something that can really modify a planet in a way that makes it unique?
Mm. Yeah, speaking of settlements on other planets, your book, Sovereign Mars, dives into governance models for space habitats. Could a Martian colony avoid Earth's mistakes, like inequality or environmental damage?
I certainly hope so. Yeah, I have a copy of my book here, Sovereign Mars. And so in my book, I look at the history of sovereignty on Earth, sovereignty being the power relationships between nation states or other entities and their ruling power over subjects or other entities. And the question I started with is who owns Mars? But then it really became, what does sovereignty mean on Mars? What would it mean for a nation or a corporation to have long duration settlements on Mars? Who sets the rules? Who is in charge? Who decides on policies for managing humans and interacting with the environment? And so what I do in my book is I look at examples of cooperative sovereignty on Earth. So these are examples of sovereign nation states working together in a way that does not necessarily cede their sovereignty to a new entity or erode their national sovereignty, but it finds a way to work together to achieve mutual goals. And so the examples include the Outer Space Treaty, which is the only space treaty that addresses sovereignty in an explicit way, and it prevents nations from claiming the moon as a new province or a new state of a country, claiming ownership over Mars or other parts of space. But then we also have examples like the Antarctic Treaty System, where you have mostly scientific activities conducted by a large number of nations on Earth, in peace with limited commercial activities for the time being. And then we have the Convention of the Law of the Seas, which allows for sharing of coastal resources with some limitations on national jurisdiction over coasts, but then the high seas being open to all. And then we now are starting to see some regulation of mining of the deep seabed. So I look at all of these examples that have worked on Earth, or at least have happened on Earth. I think about, well, what works? And then possibly more important, what doesn't work? The negative examples are going to give us some constraints on what might happen in space. And so, you ask, how do we avoid some of these problems on Earth? I think pragmatism is what we have to do. It might be nice to think about a world space agency that sets the rules and makes sure that everybody plays nice and nobody destroys Mars or over consumes resources. I don't think that's going to happen because I think nation states on Earth do not like to cede their sovereignty to new entities and erode their own national sovereignty. So I think we need to find new models of cooperative sovereignty that just account for this pragmatism, the fact that especially the spacefaring nations are not likely to agree to being under the jurisdiction of a new entity. But I think that if we start the conversation now, we can start setting precedent for how to engage in sustainable space activities in a way that does learn from our activities on Earth, from what works and what doesn't work, and try to make sure that we're not repeating some of these problems on Mars.
So basically, you're saying that Mars needs its own constitution, not just rockets.
In a sense, yeah, Mars is a very different environment than Earth. Once you get to Mars, air is a commodity. We take breathable air largely for granted on Earth. Maybe you think about pollutants, but on air, it's a manufactured commodity, and you can't live for very long without air. So you have to think about things in terms of how much air do we need? How do we have redundancy in case there's failure? Who controls the supply of air? Is air an expensive commodity? Does there need to be a price? If so, how do we make sure everybody gets enough without, running out? And so I think the physical challenges of surviving on Mars or other space environments will force us to reconsider some of the governance problems that we take for granted on Earth. And then part of why I think this is exciting to think about is we may actually go to Mars. It might be soon, it might be for a long time, even if it's a long time in the future or never. By asking these questions about how we would govern ourselves on Mars, we can actually learn things about how to do governance on Earth better.
Exactly. Yeah. Jacob, the Young Scientists Program, YSP, sounds like a launchpad for future science leaders. How does YSP nurture the next generation, and what projects are blowing your mind right now?
Yeah, I'm really excited about our Young Scientist program. It's grown substantially over the past few years. This provides an opportunity for students from literally around the world to work with our scientists, thanks to the internet, which you can do projects remotely, very sophisticated projects, in fact. And we've had students from all continents except Antarctica at this point, a huge number of countries around the world. And some of these are scientists, go on then to get graduate degrees or join our institute someday. And so it really is a training in science research. Everybody has a science or communication or education project they're working on. But we also, as part of our program, train students in how to do science communication and also how to think ethically about their science. And we do some basic training in philosophy and ethics that a lot of people don't get as part of their science training. But in terms of projects, it spans the full range of earth science, space science, and astrobiology. We have people who do bioinformatics, looking at the genetic code of microorganisms and looking at the evolutionary relationship between them, which might help understand the history of life on Earth, even the origin of life. There's one really interesting project this year that's looking at filament growths of microorganisms as an analogy for filaments in galaxies. So looking at microstructures as sort of an analogy for these macrostructures. We have education projects working on, there's a tropical stingless bee education center in South America, and the students work on educational outreach and developing technology for monitoring these beehives. There's people who use machine learning for analyzing the complexity of living and technological systems. And I've even worked with a group of students, and I'm continuing to work with them, following up on some of the ideas from my book, where we're looking at other examples of cooperative sovereignty on Earth, successful and not successful. Things like referendums, like in Catalonia or in Quebec, looking at the Universal Postal Service and the International Telecommunications Union, and then even the Pennamite-Yankee War in the early days of the United States, all as examples of problems of shared sovereignty that either worked or didn't, and what can we learn from those for applying them to space settlement.
Wow. But yeah, this is absolutely amazing. But it's not just about training scientists, is it? It's also about shaping visionaries.
Absolutely. We don't necessarily anticipate that everybody who participates in our program is going to go on to get a PhD and a professorship or be a leading researcher. I mean, we definitely encourage the participants in our program to develop their own interests, develop their own, robust thinking. We really want to train scientific thinking, train the ability to communicate complex ideas, and train the ability to think critically about the philosophical and ethical implications of what you're doing. But where you go from there is absolutely up to the student, and we encourage any number of pathways that they may want to go. I mean, we live in a very complex technological world, and so learning to think like a scientist and learning to improve your communication and your sense of ethics will benefit you no matter what you do.
Excellent, brilliant. I mean, I love it. I love it. Um, Jacob, one of BMSIS projects is Astronomy for Equity, A4E. How does pointing telescopes at the sky fight inequality?
Yeah, one of the goals of Astronomy for Equity, and the leader of this, I definitely have to give a shout out to, is Mike Simmons, who is one of the founders of Astronomers Without Borders. But yeah, now he's now leading Astronomy for Equity, which seeks to inspire communities that may not have access to robust programs in STEM, science, technology, education, and mathematics. And so space is everywhere. Obviously, everyone can look up at the night sky, and all human cultures have a historical connection to astronomy. And so, at relatively low cost, you can uh, provide the tools for some of these students who may not have other science opportunities to engage in thinking about our place in the universe. You can inspire them by showing them what, planets or galaxies look like through a telescope, help them see our place as Earthlings in the context of the broader universe, and then help develop sustained educational programs in science that can carry through their education. So they seek to not have these just one-off experiences, but rather use these experiences as a way to inspire longer duration educational projects. So this could be anything from countries that are typically marginalized because of economic difficulties. Astronomy for Equity has even done astronomy for the blind, which I think is very exciting. You don't think of
Wow.
astronomy as something for blind people, but you can do really cool things with 3D printing nowadays, and you can literally print out what it is you would see, and there's tactile sensations that can allow people to engage with what you're observing in astronomy without having sight. Or you could use sound, sonification also to do this. So I think it's being really creative to provide the experience of education, the experience of astronomy with people who may not otherwise have it. I saw that you had Frank White on the show not too long ago, and Frank White talks about the overview effect. And in a sense, this is the underview effect. You're not seeing Earth from above, but just looking out into space is a different type but related form of what you get from the overview effect. You get a deeper sense of identity as being an Earthling, and there's a deep inspiration for thinking about what else is out there. It gets you outside of your daily world. Astronomy can be very humbling and inspiring by just kind of putting into context our daily activities into the broader, huge, vast arena of the whole universe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And uh, Frank White was saying in the show, astronomy ultimately is space exploration, is a way of exploring the outer space. And we should not forget that. It's like Saturn's rings saying the universe is the universe way of saying stay fabulous. Now, Any other BMSIS projects we should geek out over?
Well, we have a group of people, studying the human dimension of space settlement. So I mentioned my book, and we have other people, in addition to myself and the students working with me, who have been thinking about both the design, the physical construction of habitats in space, as well as, the ethical dimensions, planetary protection. How do you avoid contaminating planets? And then even just thinking about the broader connections between space settlement, space exploration, and astrobiology in general. And so we have lots of great internal projects that we're working on, regular research projects, but we have a seminar series. We had previously done this just for our scientists, but we've now broadened this to a public-facing webinar series. And so we had our first installment of the webinar last month. We have the next one coming up in May, and it'll be probably about every other month. We will have a public-facing webinar. Anybody is welcome to join. You can just sign up for the BMSIS newsletter to get notices of when the next webinar is. And then we put them all on YouTube. So if you missed the live stream of the webinar, you can also watch it later. And so I'm really excited about this just because, there's a lot of talk about the construction of rockets and physical infrastructure for living in space. And this is obviously a needed prerequisite. You can't do space do exploration or live in space without the technology to do so. But there's kind of a dearth of research on thinking about the human dimensions, the governance, the ethics, planetary protection, just the psychological impact of living in space for a long duration. And so we're exploring some of this territory, again, which I think is very needed in advance of actually setting foot on Mars. The sooner and the better we think about some of these problems before we're actually doing these things, I think the greater the chances of success will be.
Yeah.
Oh, another project I can tell you about is SciWorthy.
Yes,
So
I was about to ask.
SciWorthy.com.
Thank you.
Yes, it's this is a website that seeks to distill journal articles into language that's accessible by anyone. So as scientists, the deliverables that we put out from our research are these peer-reviewed journal articles that are written in a pretty technical language. Usually you're writing to specialists in your own subdiscipline. And admittedly, they can be difficult to understand. And so SciWorthy has a team of editors that are specialized in these fields of study, but then also specialized in science communication. So they take these technical journal articles, write much shorter and easier to understand versions of them. And it's really a way to try to bridge this gap between the technical work that scientists are doing and people who just want to understand what science is like. And it helps you get into the results, learn things at the cutting edge of science, and even just understand the incremental nature of science, that not every discovery is, phenomenally world-changing, but you make little incremental steps and we learn things that way. So it's really a way to try to engage other people who are not scientists in the process of science.
It's sci-worthy because science shouldn't need a decoder ring or a PhD per se. Yes, absolutely. All right, Jacob. I have a question from one of our followers, is Stargazer Sam. He says, if we find aliens, should we send them the UN Charter or a Taylor Swift playlist?
Yeah, yes, it's a good question. Um, if we find aliens, first it depends on how far away or how close they are. Are they in the solar system? Are they on an exoplanet? Now, there's been attempts at sending various kinds of messages to extraterrestrials. The most famous was the messages sent on the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft. So the Pioneer spacecraft, Carl Sagan led the design of a plaque that showed the figures of humans and some other symbols that represented the solar system and some other basic messages. So if an extraterrestrial were to find this spacecraft, they would perhaps learn something about us and maybe even know where the spacecraft came from. The Voyager spacecraft famously had these golden records on them that recorded messages and music and other sounds from around the world to represent the diversity of human cultures. And so those are two physical artifacts that we have sent out of the solar system that in theory could be discovered by extraterrestrials. So yeah, I think there may have been both some rock music on there as well as some government documents. There's also the idea of beaming radio waves out into space, perhaps toward exoplanet systems that might be likely to host life. Um, the question of how do you communicate with an alien is a difficult one. And yeah, if we were to beam the UN Charter or Taylor Swift, for that matter, to an alien civilization, if they're listening on the other end, they may not understand what's going on. And people have talked about actually using mathematics and the physics of the universe as a way to establish a common language. So perhaps we all will observe hydrogen atoms the same way, even if we're using different number systems. You would imagine that a hydrogen atom on Earth is going to look the same as a hydrogen atom on Alpha Centauri, for example. And so there's been efforts at making these self-defining languages using mathematics and physics. And so perhaps the best way to communicate with extraterrestrials is to have at least start with a technical conversation where we establish a common framework for numbers and physics. And you may have a harder time getting into complex conversations about the reality of the human experience, at least at first. But we could hypothetically have good conversations sharing technical information and learn a lot that way. So that's at least a start if we do make such a discovery.
Hmm. Yes, between Bach and whale songs and the Chuck Berry riffs, let's see what aliens are most attracted of. Jacob, our listeners insist you are hiding a secret identity. Care to explain what the Dolphin Space Program is?
Of course. No, I'm happy you asked. So, Dolphin Space Program is a music recording project that my wife and I have. And we do musical satire, essentially. We have a number of, I think, probably about 100 different songs at this point, a handful of albums. And, we don't, I wouldn't call it science communication because not all or even most of our songs are about science. But as a scientist, of course, sometimes there are science themes that make their way into the songs. And so, I very much am a believer that, you can use music to do science communication, but I think perhaps an even deeper way to make the music fun and relatable is the science or other ideas can be a starting point for creating art and helping us resonate with that and express, perhaps, more fun or human ideas through the music.
Yeah. Well, I suggest we listen a few seconds of one of your hits. I picked one for our listeners. Is Grandma Got Run Over by a Saucer.
Grandma got run over by a saucer, walking home from our house in the snow. You can say there's no such thing as aliens, but now me and Grandpa watch for UFOs. She'd been reading too much Reddit, and we begged her please to stop.
Yeah, no, this
Yeah.
was from our recent holiday album, which was a lot of fun to put together. And yeah, of course, I probably don't have to say much about the relevance of this song, but no, it was a lot of fun.
Yes.
And I'll mention, we have actually another album coming out just on April 14th, which I'm looking forward to.
Jolly good. Well, we put on a screen here the link to your website, where our listeners can enjoy pieces of your music. There is a music tab there for that. And I say, NASA's lost our gain, Jacob. Th- This has been stellar. Thanks for decoding the cosmos and for the intergalactic heralds.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Folks, follow BMSIS at bluemarblespace.org and bmsis.org. Check out their public webinars and dive into Cyworthy's mind-blowing articles. Next week, we are hacking the laws of physics with a rebel astrophysicist. Until then, keep looking up.
To the night, a blanket of stars. We're setting our sights on worlds near and far. With every conversation, we're breaking new ground. In the heart of exploration, our dreams are profound. From Mars to the cosmos, we'll make our stand, unraveling mysteries with a hopeful hand. We're joined by the dreamers, the pioneers of fate. Together we'll chart what awaits us in space. On the highway to space, we'll soar ever high. With our hearts full of wonder, let's reach for the sky. In this journey together, we're lighting the way. The future of exploring is ours here today. With astronauts guiding and artists in tow, scientists dreaming where the wild comets flow. Each guest tells a story, each voice adds a spark, as we forge our path through the shadows and dark. The search for new life and the tales yet untold. In the theater of space, our adventures unfold, inspiring the youth with stars in their eyes. The next generation will claim their own skies. On the highway to space, we'll soar ever high. With our hearts full of wonder, let's reach for the sky.